Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, When Active Directory Force Recovery Has to Work. We've got a great presentation prepared today to talk more about security strategies to best protect your hybrid AD, Azure AD, and Office 365. With us today, we have Chaosoft founder Robert Boble, who I'll be introducing momentarily. Before we get started, if everyone could take a moment to follow us on social media. You'll see here on the screen a QR code for each of your favorite social networks. With your phone's camera, scan that little box below and it'll take you directly to our social page. So let's get started. I'm McKenna. I work alongside the Microsoft experts here at Chaosoft. Just a couple housekeeping items to go over before we jump into the presentation. First off, you'll notice your microphones are muted to make sure everyone has the optimal listening experience. But we do encourage you to ask any questions you may have. So depending on how you join today, either in browser or through the app, you'll see a question or chat section in your meeting dashboard. Feel free to drop your questions in there and we'll do our best to answer them. If we run short on time today, we'll reach out to you individually to follow up. While you're in your meeting dashboard, also make sure to check out the handout section where we've included additional resources you can download and share with your team. This session will also be recorded and we'll email you a link in the days following. At the end of the presentation, we'll also be sharing our contact information. So if you have any additional questions or you're watching this on demand, please feel free to reach out. At the end of the presentation, we'll also be drawing one lucky winner of a $100 Amazon gift card. So make sure you stay on the line until then as we draw from the list of those present at that time. So now that we've got all of that taken care of, let's jump in. So today we have the founder of Chaosoft, Robert Boble. Bob is one of the leading experts in hybrid Active Directory management and recovery. And with more than 25 years in the Microsoft identity industry, he has tons of insights to share. So you guys are in great hands today. And on that note, I'll pass it over to Bob.
Yeah, thank you, McKenna. I really appreciate that. I'm pretty excited at today's presentation. But I want to start off with a question. We talked a little bit at the very beginning, or McKenna mentioned hybrid Active Directory. We also see it referred to as hybrid Azure Active Directory. And just to make sure everybody's clear, that means that you've taken your legacy Active Directory on-premise and connected it to Azure Active Directory in Microsoft's Azure environment, typically through the use of a tool called Azure AD Connect. So the question I want to ask everybody is Active Directory on-premise or legacy Active Directory still relevant? Well, we wanted to know that, and so we went to Gartner and had them formulate that question and send it out to a group in a survey. And the response came back, it was absolutely still relevant. In fact, we'll see here they came up with a percentage showing how many people were still relying on on-premise Active Directory. But one of the questions in that survey was, what are the three most important impacts that a failure of that Active Directory on-premise would cause, or what were they most concerned about? And this question was designed to judge just what that level of reliance on on-premise Active Directory still was, even though we've been hearing all sorts of things about people going to Azure Active Directory and hybrid Active Directory for being more agile and more resilient to problems. The number one answer that came back is that the organization that IT expert represented, either an IT manager or director, their organization would cease to operate if on-premise Active Directory had an outage. There were other items, they'd lose revenue, they'd lose production data, they'd be embarrassed. There were quite a few others. But when you realize that an entire organization would be offline, it's a pretty startling revelation. The idea is that the legacy Active Directory is not yet replaced with Azure Active Directory. It's not a functional equivalent, and so people are still reliant on it. A lot of times people will have, even the swipe badges they use to get into a door in a large enterprise, those might be integrated with Active Directory. The conference rooms, right? A lot of retailers have their cash registers integrated with that on-premise Active Directory. And so if there's a disruption of that on-premise Active Directory, the organization is out of business effectively. And we've seen other organizations actually cease to exist, not just cease to operate, but cease to exist. We'll point those out in a minute. So what's the impact here of hybrid Active Directory? Well, in that same study, Gartner came back and told us that roughly 70% of enterprises were in this hybrid Active Directory, hybrid Azure Active Directory mode, meaning they were synchronizing to the on-premise environment. So I was kind of impressed with that. There's only 30% that aren't out of all the, millions of organizations that are using Active Directory. So I wanted to kind of think a little bit about what is the weakest link in a hybrid Azure Active Directory environment. And on-premise Active Directory was by far the clearest problem. And there were some reasons for that, primarily that the native tools just don't exist. They provide little control over the day-to-day management of directory data, which means if you're trying to use native tools to manage your environment, you're going to see problems with incorrect group memberships, wrong department names, all sorts of crazy things that just in the data itself. And it's very complex. Active Directory on premise is very, very complex. That's one of the appealing aspects of Azure Active Directory. You don't have to worry about the configuration of the core directory itself. You just have to worry about your policies and the security you apply. But the on-premise directory is very complex, including the physical servers called domain controllers that you have to have care and feeding over and maintain. And also built in, there is no AD forest recovery. So if your Active Directory gets compromised at the broadest level, which is the forest level, there's nothing there to bring that back, no tools to bring that back. Microsoft has some guidance, but it's a web page. And unfortunately, AD is under unprecedented attack because it's been identified as the weakest link. I can't say that Azure AD is perfect. It also suffers from some of the same problems. But let's face it, the combination of AD and Azure, it's still the best directory service provided for business, bar none. There are other people coming out saying that they're better, but frankly, the ubiquity and widespread use of this is why it's under attack. Unfortunately, Active Directory on-premise was never really built to connect to the cloud, and so that opens it up. Without help, you can definitely find yourself in trouble. So what about attacks? How do we know that Active Directory and Azure Active Directory are really a target for hackers? Well, the history is there. Here we have just a brief snapshot in time from December of 2020 to May of 2022, just showing some of the most important attacks that you're seeing. This does mention the SolarWinds attack, which was an attack both on Active Directory on-premise and Azure Active Directory. The last one down there is probably a pretty disheartening one with the attack on Ukraine. One of the very first things that the Russians did was attack the directories as a wiperware attack and try to wipe out their directories to cripple them so that they couldn't have people using those systems. But in May of last year, Lincoln College, which has been around for 150 some years, was hit with a ransomware attack. They did not have any third-party plan or software to recover from that, and the costs were so large to bring it all back that they ended up closing the school because they had an inability to recover from it. So what makes Active Directory such an easy target? This is the on-premise directory compared to other components in that hybrid mix. It's very complex, difficult to manage efficiently. There are no built-in tools to help you monitor what's actually going on, especially around changes. You get event logs, but event logs are often the first target. If you're looking at an event log tool or a SIEM tool, they're all event driven. And so, somebody goes and wipes out event logs or attacks that first, then those monitoring tools, AD auditing, change auditing tools are blinded. It's susceptible to denial of service. So people can hit those domain controllers, take them offline simply by pushing lots of traffic to them, slowing them down. There are a lot of attack vectors on Active Directory, both configuration mistakes, but then there are also security vulnerabilities that may be fairly well known to an attacker, and they may take over a workstation and use that to gain access to administration capabilities, then attack the domain controllers that way. It is difficult to recover. We're going to see that here in a moment. And you really need to get your logins working first if you're hit with a ransomware attack or a wiperware attack, and then go and work on all the applications because the applications are all integrated into Active Directory. And so without Active Directory and those user accounts, the applications themselves are inaccessible. So it's important to understand that it's definitely a problem if you don't take the appropriate steps. Now, there is some good news. You can proactively prepare for this and do a pretty darn good job defending Active Directory, and even if you find a compromise, working around it. So Gartner Group, that same group we just had working on the study, has created this area that they're researching and monitoring and really spending a lot of effort on called Identity Threat Detection and Response. And effectively, it is looking for indicators of risk in environments. So monitoring your Active Directory and your Azure Active Directory, looking for things that are potentially like misconfigurations that potentially could open the door to an attack vector or an attacker coming in and doing things that you don't want them to do. monitoring those same identity systems, Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, looking for indications that maybe an attack has already occurred or might be in progress. Sometimes there are, with certain attacks, remnants of the attack that if you find these remnants, you can pretty much be sure that an attack has occurred. And then also provide a response to these things. So if I do find an indicator of either risk or an attack, how do I mitigate that? How do I take care of it? How do I fix the problem or resolve the problem? Worst case scenario, they take out the directory with a ransomware attack or wiper attack, and I have to recover the whole directory or the whole forest. But there are things that you can do if you find indicators of risk or indicators of attack that don't require to do that whole thing. But you need the guidance there, right? So whatever system that's monitoring for these things should also then provide the guidance on how to recover or respond to those things. Notice I say respond. It's not always recover. Sometimes it's updating a configuration, changing a password. Could be more than just recovering. So ideally, you have all this stuff in place because it's very easy for attackers, especially with ransomware, to hit environments. So ransomware, wiperware are sort of this category of attack that the idea is to either completely wipe out your directory, just make it gone, right? Just knock it offline and make it unusable. Or it has a financial component to it, which is let's lock it up, we'll compress it, encrypt it, and then charge a ransom fee. And if they pay the ransom, maybe we'll give them the decryption key so they can use the system. Maybe we won't. It's kind of the attacker's viewpoint. But the bad guys either create the software or they'll actually buy it or lease it from other attackers, which is really frightening. It's like an industry. They'll use social engineering or they'll use some other vehicle to get the ransomware into the environment, like a link, a bad URL, something like that. Then they encrypt your IT systems or destroy them if it's a wiperware. And then they use that encrypted data as a leverage point to extort. Here is an example of one of the messages you could potentially see if you've been hit with ransomware. Now, this was only $300 worth of Bitcoin, so it's pretty low value, but there's definitely was put a time limit on it. And after that point, if you don't pay the ransom, then you have basically no chance. A couple other real quick things. Some organizations are now saying that because of the way things are set up in their environment, because of the liabilities, they will not negotiate, they will not pay these ransoms. And so those environments absolutely have to have identity threat protection, detection, and response already in place ahead of time so that they can have identity resilience, meaning even if they get hit with ransomware, they're not going to go offline. So in Active Directory on-premise in particular, why is it so difficult to recover from a ransomware attack? Well, it's a complex process to recover. And most people are still of the mindset that, oh, well, we'll face that later on, right? Most IT groups have now realized that they should prepare for when they get hit with ransomware instead of the older way of thinking, which is if I get hit, something would happen. So just pretend you're going to get hit, prepare for that so that you have a process in place all ready to recover. So why is this complex? Well, it's first of all very time consuming and expensive because you're offline if your forest goes down. Ransomware encrypts all your domain controllers. It's very expensive because there's no business occurring. As you saw from that survey, likely your organization is not operating. And unfortunately, there's a lot of pressure. The users are out there screaming at IT, hey, when can I get into my Office apps or into my database? And then management screaming because they realize the costs involved. And it's a long, drawn out process. So you have to really understand and have gone through it in practice mode at least once so you know what's going on. Best if your system just automatically tests and does this stuff automatically for you. But we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. But for every single domain, there's a long list of tasks here, and we put some of them, the basic ones on the right. To recover a domain in your forest, you're going to have to do all 22 of those steps for each domain, and then there are sub-steps for every domain controller that you need. But you also need to know where those domain controllers are, which ones you have to have for recovery, et cetera. Maersk, the largest shipping company, was hit several years ago. They took 9 days to bring Active Directory back. And there's a quote from their CISO that says, hey, by the way, 9 days is not good. You should aspire to be back up and running within 24 hours. That's a pretty big challenge. A lot of systems out there will help you recover Active Directory, third-party tools. Trying to do it natively, you're going to be doing it in a couple days. Even with testing and practicing, it'll probably take you a couple days, 3, 4, 5, 6. Maersk took 9 because of the complexity of their environment. And then you can start working on the applications. So I'm going to tell you right now, while you can do it natively, there are some drawbacks, and we're going to talk about those. That guy spent 70 nights sleeping in his office during that attack when they were hit with ransomware. So what are the existing recovery methods? And we're going to talk about the pros and cons for each. There are four. You have manual recovery, which is the Microsoft guidance. There is no actual software that helps you do it. You just have to prepare ahead of time. Again, that can take 24 to 72 hours to try and bring it back. There's bare metal recovery, which a lot of vendors claim that they have recovery, which we're going to talk about, and they do. There's some issues with that. We'll talk about the legacy products, then we'll talk about something called instant forest recovery, which is a fault tolerant recovery method. So let's look at the first one, manual recovery. So this is derived from a guidance page that Microsoft has. It's a website with 30 or some pages on it. They effectively tell you to find a server and then go through a manual recovery. So if you have one server from each of the domains, you can kind of recover the whole forest, but it can take days or weeks to actually do the recovery. Most of the time, this is what people are faced with if they think that it'll never happen to them. Way this fails is very simple. There are no good servers and they don't take things into consideration. So for example, if you're trying to have a offline server on the on-premise AD and you're in hybrid mode, well, it's going to have some age to it. The database may not work correctly with synchronization. And so trying to do an offline DC also is one of those things that people think they can get away with, and they may have in the past. Hybrid makes that really a difficult proposition to get to work. So no good servers left, no way to recover. That's what happened with Lincoln College. And they don't take other things into consideration like hybrid. They think they can continue to do it with a script or something else. I have seen scripting be built. Not sure why I would use a $90 million script when there are third-party applications out there that are probably doing a much better job. Bare metal backup and recovery. So this is traditional vendors. They offer Active Directory recovery. You'll see Metallic, Commvault, Veeam, Acronis. They all kind of talk about Active Directory recovery. And in this case, they back up and restore the entire server, including the operating system. Now, this will bring back those Active Directory DCs pretty quickly, but the chances it actually works are pretty low. And the reason being is if you're hit with a ransomware or wiperware attack, that's in the operating system. That is code that's executing as an application in the OS. It's infected the OS. And guess what? Full backups of your machine include the operating system, which is the infected part. And so they don't use what we call clean backups. They use a full image of the machine, which as soon as they restore it, guess what? The ransomware hits again, or the wiperware or other type of malware executes, and you're right back to where you were before you recover. Now, you may be able to get back a couple weeks, maybe, we would hope, but you don't really know when that was introduced. So it may be as soon as the old backups come back, you could be beyond a recoverable point, or they may just execute the ransomware anyway. So most of the time, people realize that even an hour or a day and then having the chance of losing it all again, it just isn't worth it. There are much better ways to do it. So number three are the legacy recovery, backup and recovery for AD forests. There are really only two companies that provide this. There's the Alita tools from Quest. They acquired Alita, Quest software, and then there's Semperis, a newer vendor. There's really nothing new in those solutions. But the idea is they use what's called a clean backup, which is really the genius part about these tools. And a clean backup only gets the Active Directory database, and then it scans it to make sure that there isn't something in the directory partition or in the application partition that is part of the attack. It'll grab DNS settings, machine settings for all your DCs. These can be kind of complex to set up. And then the recovery is you have a whole separate infrastructure. So you go out and you buy all these computers, one for every domain controller you need to bring back, or a VM that just sits out there waiting for the recovery. And it takes hours or days to do the recovery. They do have some things that'll help you get operating system on the new systems a little bit faster, but you don't ever really know it's going to work until you have to use it in anger. So testing becomes a huge issue, right? So a lot of people will test once a year, and then they go to do a real recovery, and then drivers have changed or other issues. Maybe there's some problem with the hardware. Who knows what the issues are, but because you're only using this when you have a problem to do the recovery, you don't know it's going to recover until you actually are either you fail or succeed in the recovery. So there is definitely a better way to do this, but this is what we've lived with for quite some time. And again, nothing really new here. A lot of you may be using these tools already. They are definitely better than bare metal, and they're definitely better than no recovery tools at all. But there is a better, faster, cheaper way, and we're going to talk about that here in a minute. So I mentioned recovery testing. So that same survey we had, we also asked what is the best practice for testing your legacy backup and recovery solutions, and what do you actually do? And 45% said that they really think it should be done quarterly, so every 3 months, but less than a third were actually, less than 27% were actually doing it that much. And if you look and you start to add up the numbers, 50% were doing it less than quarterly. So that means that the farther out you do those testing because of the complexity, or you have to refresh the hardware after that to prepare for your next actual outage, you've dirtied the hardware by doing the recovery. Now you got to clean all those machines. You can't just throw it all away. So it makes it very difficult because of the complexity. So half the people are not testing adequately, which means the chances of a failed recovery go up again. So, what are the lingering issues or problems with those three previous types of forest recoveries that people are talking about? Well, setup is very complex. You have to pre allocate a bunch of servers or VMs, and they just sit there costing you time and money. You have to have a bunch of extra servers in your environment. They're just sitting there not doing anything. You have potential for broken backups. So, again, you don't know they're going to work until you actually try to do the recovery. It'd be nice if you could just kind of pre recover and see what's going on. And then again, that last piece, you never really know it's going to work until you actually try a recovery. And even with all the testing in the world, if you're only testing quarterly, how many updates does Microsoft do to their server software in a month's time? Well, there are typically 4 Tuesdays, and that's when they do their updates. So you have 12 opportunities to screw up a recovery because of all the push of updates that Microsoft does. So those are the old ways. So let's talk about the new way of doing recovery. We call this instant forest recovery. This is exclusive to Chaosoft. I'll be upfront with that, but we're certain it's a much better way of doing things. So who does it? Chaosoft does it. We do have a patent that's pending on this technology. The method's a little bit different. We do create a clean backup, but we use that clean backup very similar to the legacy Quest and some Paris tools, but we automatically create a fault tolerant clone of your forest in Azure or in AWS. And so what happens is we do the backup of your domain controllers, and we do all the same things that you'd expect. We check the partitions for other viruses. We encrypt those backups so they can't be stolen and used other ways. We get all of the machine configuration, the name, the IP addresses. We get DNS, we get group policy, we get all those things, and then we immediately restore it into the cloud, and we programmatically create what's called an isolated recovery site. So you actually every night can create a forest. So maybe every third night you tell it to just go ahead and delete the first night. Now, most of the billing in AWS and Azure will give you a grace period of a couple days. And if you set it up right, there may be no cost to doing that as well. So you don't have all that hardware, software sitting out there until they decide that they need to charge for this. We're not seeing a forest that's being constructed with any relevant costs in the first week of that or first couple days of having those VMs out there. You're still in that test mode. But the best part about this, and the reason we call it instant recovery, is because I don't have to, under all that pressure, when I have an outage, perform a recovery. The recovery is just rerouting the authentication, the login traffic from your domain controllers that were on premise that are all now locked up and shut down. You reroute that traffic to the cloud. And because the cloud is available around the globe, I kind of abstract all those routing issues. And now all of a sudden, with the change of a routing table, you're back in business. And that takes a minute or two, right? So the longest amount of wait time would be to recognize you had an outage. Once you recognize the outage, you just flip it over. And by the way, you could leave them in place to test that. Just change the routing, see how it works, change it back to do your testing. It's maybe a minute to try the test, a minute to take it off. But the idea is that because we're pre-recovering those into a working clone of your forest, you now have the opportunity every day or every couple of days to know that it worked. And you're just going to switch over to that clone. You're not going to have to worry about, am I going to recover and is the recovery going to work, right? By the way, just as an aside, we also support the old method. If you want to have all that hardware in your environment or all those VMs, we can do all that sort of stuff as well. But most people are looking at this as the more modern approach. Plus, it eliminates all those problems around testing and the time it takes to recover, et cetera. So the idea of a failure in this case, it is possible, is that you set up the software, it does its creation of these isolated recovery sites, and something happens and you don't pay attention to the alert you get in your email, or or whatever. You still have to look at the software occasionally to make sure it's functioning as you like. It is primarily set it and forget it, but you also have to make sure that there aren't errors occurring. Maybe the service account password expired or something crazy that we need during that process. But there's very, very low chance it'll fail. If it does, it's going to be well before any time you'd need that to bring back the recovery. So it's fault tolerance versus backup and recovery. Think of it that way. Instant forest recovery is simple to set up, very, very reliable because it's doing the recovery automatically in the background, every other night or whenever your schedule dictates. It's an automatic recovery to switch over. You just change a routing table. It's super simple. We use those clean backups that I mentioned that are very similar to what Quest or Semperis would use. It does not bring the operating system along, so there's no chance of reinfection like you would with Veeam or Commvault or Metallic. And it's almost instant recovery, literally as fast as you can send that router update to that routing table. That's your recovery time. So it's super, super simple. Now, we don't typically do demos in our webinars, but I do want to mention we are going to demonstrate this. The next upcoming demo we have of instant forest recovery is on March 2nd. So that's not too far in the distant future, a couple weeks. And then we'll have this on demand as well. And so if you want to register for this, you can either look in your email. There'll be a registration link that you get after this session, or you can go to chaosoft.com/events. Now, we mentioned instant forest recovery. I also want to mention, if you're new to Chaosoft, we do provide a holistic approach to hybrid AD security. We provide a management solution. We have a continuous real-time monitoring solution that also allows you to reverse mistakes. So if somebody deletes a group, or worse, they update the group membership or strip the group membership, when the data changes in AD or Azure AD or even in the Teams configurations, whatever you're doing, we see that. You can use our tool then to roll those changes back. We do group policy, we do conditional access policies, and we do have full alerting there. So if there's some change you want to watch for because it shouldn't happen, like there's an Azure AD escalation of privilege that any Office 365 global admin can perform. It's both not logged and there's no warning it happens and you can't stop it. It's just a built-in, we'll call it a feature. We can alert on things like that. That also has free threat detection built into it as well. So not only do you have rollback, but we also have threat detection, which I mentioned earlier, looking for indications of risk and indications of attack. Both of those are built in. And then finally, identity resilience. That is the full-blown forest recovery. We do true hybrid recovery, so we will make sure that both sides of the directory are working properly. And we mentioned the continuous threat detection as well. So with that, I hope everybody got enough out of today's session. We wanted to keep it short and sweet. If you have any questions, feel free to ask those and we'll get back with you. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to McKenna.
Thanks, Bob. All right, so that concludes our presentation today. We'd like to thank everyone for their time and hope you enjoyed the webinar. At this time, we'll go ahead and take attendance for the gift card drawing, and we'll email the winner directly for more information. You'll also see on the screen a few quick links for the Chaosoft website. Should you have any additional questions, you can visit chaosoft.com/question. If you'd like to schedule a personalized demo or get our free trial, you'll see those links here on the screen as well. We also have a QR code on the screen here that you can, again, scan with your phone's camera, and it'll take you directly to our demo request page. And of course, for more information about Chaosoft and our solutions, feel free to visit chaosoft.com. Again, thank you so much for your time, and everyone have a great day.